So the scope has expanded over recent years. We started focusing on this topic as the number of people working remotely with digital tools increased so substantially during the pandemic. And it became ever more evident that if you're working remotely and there's this blurring between work life and family life, people tend to work longer hours and don't have sufficient rest breaks. So the European Commission asked us to review the legislation at national and EU level. Is it still fit for purpose? What's being done in the member states? We then moved on to another research project which looked at company practices, a number of case studies, examples of how they are implementing the right to disconnect. And with our European working conditions telephone survey data, we again looked at what are the working hours of remote workers, what are the work-life balance and health implications of remote working. And again, it was confirmed that they work longer hours, they potentially have insufficient rest breaks, and there are implications, health implications. We then decided that there's still not enough quantitative data on the implementation of the right to disconnect at company level, and there's definitely no evidence that we could find on how having a right to disconnect impacts on job satisfaction, work-life balance, well-being, and certain health indicators for workers. So that's why we conducted the most recent study. So we know from our European Working Conditions telephone survey that there are implications for working time and for rest breaks. So longer working hours, shorter rest breaks, and that leads to health conditions such as the risk of burnout, higher rates of stress, anxiety, but also physical symptoms like musculoskeletal disorders. And in our most recent survey, 45% of respondents said it negatively impacted their work-life balance and their family life, but also had some implications on their health. Among our respondents in companies with and without a right to disconnect, there were 90% in companies with a right to disconnect that said they had a good work-life balance. That was only 80% in companies without. There was a smaller share of workers reporting health issues, so that was 28% in companies with a right to disconnect and 38% in companies without. And workers were generally more satisfied, so the share of those saying they were highly satisfied was much higher. The share of those saying they were not satisfied was twice as high in companies without a right to disconnect than in a company with. The findings are published at quite a pivotal moment, because after nearly 12 months of negotiations, the European cross-industry social partners' discussions on telework and the right to disconnect have just ended, and they were unable to reach an agreement on these topics. So in 2021, the European Parliament adopted a resolution asking the European Commission to come forward with legislation on the right to disconnect. But that resolution also acknowledged the important role of social partners. So hence we had the negotiations since, but now that these have not reached a conclusion, it's back in the court of the European Commission to potentially take some legislative action in this area. Surprisingly, it was 80% of our respondents that said that they had received some work-related communication outside of their contractual working hours, and over 30% of that was from colleagues, around 20% from clients, and just under 20% from line managers. Now, what is also troubling is that a lot of workers responded to those communications immediately. And around 75% of those respondents said they felt that it was expected of them. An even higher share said that they wanted to do this in order to stay on top of their work, but nonetheless, the relatively high share of people saying they felt they needed to is of some concern.